So you're going to take your zipper and you're going to line up your fabric edge with the tape, but the lining on your fabric is going to go against the back side of your zipper. So you're just simply going to turn the zipper so the zipper pull is laying on the table, and then the exact edge of that zipper pull, line that up with your edge of your fabric, and then you're going to pin it so that
is it the type of pattern lining? Should
the pattern lining is lined up to the back side of the zipper.
I'm just asking if it's right side down or right side up.
Oh, you have a design on yours, so right side down. Sorry, mine didn't have a design, so so yes, if you have a design, it's right side down. I'm then going to turn this around so it's facing up, and the right side of my fabric, which in my case has a design, it's going to be right side down and lining up with that same edge of your zipper. And now watch your fingers, because you've got pins on the back side, and you are going to pin it again, lining up with the top of the zipper. And you want to be very precise with this, because if you're not, the way we sew this on here will create issues if they're not just simply lined up. So I'm pinning. This is one of those times where you definitely want to pin everything so that it holds in place. Now we're going to baste, and if you remember, basting means a temporary stitch. We are going to baste all of these layers together. Oftentimes, basting happens when you have 3 layers going on. So we've got fabric, zipper, and fabric. Oftentimes, that is one of the key times where basting is going to happen. You have more than 2 fabrics working at the same time, and things are going to shift when you're trying to sew on the sewing machine, so you are going to baste. So sewing needle on, when you're sewing by hand a basting stitch, you're going to put a knot on one end, and you knot the tail end of your thread, but you're not going to knot the other end. So the basting, again, you sewing all of these layers together, and I'll pull my pins out as I'm sewing, but not until I get to that part. And it's a long stitch. Basting stitch is a long stitch. It is it's a stitch that you're going to easily take out later on. So you want it to be a nice long, but it's a long running stitch. And you're just going to hold all of these layers together. If you don't hold them together with a basting stitch, they will not stay lined up at the sewing machine, no matter how good you are. You probably need years and years of experience. Lost my tail of my thread. I have to rethread my needle here. That is not something that happens often, but it does happen. When you're threading a needle, my needle has a very small eye. If your thread doesn't want to go through the eye, turn the needle, because the way needles are built, that eye is a hole that has been punched in the metal. And when it's punched, one side is smooth and the other side is not. So if it's not going in one way, turn the needle over and it'll slide in the other way, because just the mechanics of how a sewing needle is constructed. Almost ran out of thread, but I do not knot this end so that when I get ready to pull this out, it just slides out. So I have basted all these layers together. They all line up exactly, okay? So you always want your fabrics to line up just exactly. So all three layers all end in the exact same place. And we are now going to sew this on the sewing machine. You have a zipper pull, and the way we're sewing this on our sewing machine isn't going to create a lot of trouble, and that's why we're doing it the way we're doing it. Later on you can do it you know, and be more close to the teeth, but the way we're going to use it, our feet on these commercial sewing machine really have you sew about 1/4 of an inch. So what I'm going to do is the teeth here on my zipper, if I put my finger here along the teeth, you can pretty much feel the indent of where the teeth are. So when we sew, I'm going to have you put the foot right up against the teeth here on the zipper, so that you sew about 1/4 of an inch away. And we are going to sew through all these 3 layers all at once. You're going to back stitch here, and you're just going to sew across. I'm going to lift my presser foot here. I'm going to set my presser foot down so that the side of my presser foot is pressing against the teeth, and back stitch. And because we have basted all of this, nothing is going to shift, and it'll just, and my finger is here ahead so that I'm always gauging where that presser foot is. When I get to this pull, the pull is going to get just a little gnarly, and so I open it just a tad, but know that when I get ready to sew past it, you just kind of pay a little more attention, and then just continue back stitch all the way to the end. So clean up my stitches here, and I have one side of my bag pouch sewn on here, and clean up my stitches. So you simply, after you baste, you're going to sew this down. Okay? You are going to repeat the process on the other side of the zipper. So right now my zipper is inside of these two fabrics. When I open it up, I expose my zipper. So I'm going to pull my zipper out, and I'm now going to lay it again so that I can see this, the opposite side of the tape that I haven't attached anything to. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to place my fabric lining on the back side of the zipper. So the lining goes on the back side. I'm going to pin that on, lining all of it up nicely. After I pin the lining, I will turn it over and pretty side down, face side down, I'm going to pin the front side of the fabric to the front side of the zipper. Again, to make my life easy, I'm going to baste, hand baste all of these. It's actually quicker to hand baste these. I'm now going to baste this side together. After I baste it, repeat and sew on the sewing machine. Remember, you've got pins on the back side. They will snag your fingers, so be careful. Keep them in mind. If you're not precise with basting these together, potentially when you sew them on the sewing machine, they're not actually going to all sew down. You might have a hole. So you want to make sure that they're actually all exactly lined up. And again, at the sewing machine, I'm going to line these up. Back stitch. Follow the teeth. So the edge of my presser foot is pushing against the teeth. When you look at the front side of the fabric, if you see your basting stitches, pull them out. This is the time to pull them out. If they, on the other side of your sewing line, your machine sewing line, you might not even have to pull it out. But I have it on the teeth side, my basting stitch, which means this needs to come back out. On this side here, it's opposite, and it really doesn't need to come out. So you really want to check and make sure that the basting stitches are not on the front side of your bag. It's just, you know, not a finished look at that point. So depends on how straight of a line you sewed, whether you end up with stitches showing or not. So you want to clean those up next. You should have now fabric on either side of your zipper. Your front of zipper should match the front of your fabric. Your back of your zipper should line up with the lining fabric. So both of these should all line up. Once all of these are attached, all four fabrics are attached to the zipper, you are now going to assemble the last part. And in the assemblage, you are going to turn and match, line up your fabric so that the front of fabric matches the front of fabric and lining matches lining. So now you're going to have to open this zipper a little bit, because if you don't, when we get ready to sew all of this together, you will not be able to access the inside of the bag. So again, you're going to line up front of fabric to front of fabric, and you're going to pin these together. And again, making sure that everything matches nicely. You're going to pin all the way around. Notice that my pin heads are out, so that when I'm sewing with my pin heads out, I can remove easily the pins from the fabric. When you get ready to sew the zipper, you want the zipper to turn towards the lining. But right now you don't have to do anything special with that. You just simply need to line all of these up. Because you've cut these identically in size, make sure that in fact they match. So for instance, over here, they're not matching, so I'm going to pull them and match these cut edges. Always, your cutting has to be always exact. Sewing is a science. There is geometry to why things come together the way they do. So you want to make sure that you're actually following these simple steps. Once you have pinned all of it, so as you can see, everything matches nicely. And yes, your zipper is longer. If your zipper that you bought was bigger than the fabric, that's okay. Your zipper is going to be longer because we can adjust a longer zipper and make it shorter. Can't make a shorter one grow, but I can make a longer one shorter. So I'm pinning all 4 sides. I'm going all the way around. After I have pinned all 4 sides, I want you to mark. So I'm going to have it in my sewing machine in this way. Mark a 3-inch opening on the lining, meaning this is 3 inches. Here I'm going to just simply lay this on here, and I put it in the center. So I don't need a big mark, but I have marked my fabric with a distance of 3 inches here. When I sew, I'm going to start sewing on this bottom mark, and I'm going to go all the way around, and I'm going to end here. So I'm going to back stitch, and then when I go all the way around, I'm going to end here, and I'm going to back stitch. Do not sew inside of this 3 inches. So that has to stay unsewn. We're also going to sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So on your sewing machine, make sure that your tape, which I just tore, is at the 1/2 inch mark. So not the first line, but the second line. That's what it's showing, right? Because that's where that number is. That is 1/2 inch. I'm going to go all the way around, and I'm going to sew a 1/2 inch from the edge, meaning my seam allowance is 1/2 inch. The edge of my fabric is going to line up with the tape. And remember when we did turns and we turned at corners, I'm going to go into my corner. You can mark it ahead of time, or you can just, I need one more stitch to be a 1/2 inch. Okay, and there I'm exactly at a 1/2 inch, and I will continue to sew. As I get to my zipper, I'm going to fold the zipper towards the lining, and the teeth are going to be centered. In other words, I'm not going to see the teeth. The teeth are going to be in the middle of that fold. And just go slowly. It sews over the zipper just beautifully. And that's why we like these zippers, because we can sew over the zipper. We can't sew over the stop metal, but I can sew over the zipper teeth. And I turn at my 1/2 inch, and I just keep going all the way 1/2 inch. turn at my 1/2 inch, drop the pin, and when I get closer to the zipper again, I'm going to turn the zipper towards my lining. So the zipper tape is going to go towards the lining. Again, coming up to my 2/2 inch seam allowance. And I will stop at that line. Remember, we had that line. So I'm going back stitch. And I sewed all the way around, but not the distance, that 3-inch distance that I marked. That 3 inches, do not sew on that 3-inch mark. Every time you have these 90-degree angles in sewing, and you have this fabric that comes off of a 90-degree angle sewing line, you trim away the excess fabric, because this excess fabric will not fit inside here nicely. It's too much. So you want to trim it away by cutting it on an angle. So basically you're cutting away a triangle. Leave about 1/8 of an inch distance between where your sewing line and where you cut. But you're going to go ahead and trim away all 4 of these 90-degree angles. So you're going to do it on front side of fabric, and you're going to do that on the lining of the fabric. All this excess, anytime if you're doing a cuff on a shirt, there will be a 90-degree angle on the cuff of the shirt. You have to remove the excess fabric. You will do this in garments. You will do it anytime you have this 90-degree angle in sewing. Once you have cut those, using the hole that you left open, you are going to turn your bag right side out. You can only do that by, if you've left your zipper open, by pulling everything through. So I go ahead and I open now the rest of the way. We leave most of it closed because it holds everything together a lot better. But you're going to pull everything to the right side, and the corners, the 90-degree corners, need to be sharp. So my jacket 90-degree corner here, there is absolutely no doubt that that is a point right there. Well, you want all of your sewing always all 90-degree corners. So I'm just taking my pin. You can take anything that has a point. I'm not going to use the pin itself, but anything that has a point, and you're going to push those corners out until you have a sharp point on those corners. So you've got 4 of those, and I want you to push those, all of them, out all the way, because if I don't have a sharp corner, that points are deducted. So you're going to make sure that all of your seams are pushed out all the way, okay? So now when I'm looking at a point, I'm looking at a point, not just a pretend point. I've actually got a tool here that I use for pushing out points. I get it up to a point, and then I use my little tool to get it the rest of the way. And it's pretty sharp. It's wood, but it's pretty sharp, and it wants to even push through the fabric here. So okay, I'm going to push all of them out. So you almost have a bag. Before I close anything, remember that your zipper is very long on one end. Well, we don't need all that extra length. The excess I just cut away. And now I have a nice clean bag on the inside. Okay. We are not done because we have a hole. And this hole, I want you to basically do a nice invisible zip stitch. And I'm going to use a dark color to contrast here so you can see. Since you've already sewn up to the hole, that seam is already established, that seam allowance. It's already established. You don't have to try to create a seam allowance. You're just simply going to follow the seam allowance that's already there. And because my thread is black for contrast, I wouldn't have used a black thread, but that's for contrast. I take my needle and I'm going to place it at the one end of where I did my back stitch, and then my knot was small, so now that I know my knot's small, I'll not pull as hard. So if I just pull on the fabric, you'll notice that the seam allowance just automatically turns. And I'm just going to do this little catch. I'm going to walk it down along the seam to the other side, walk it down along the seam to the other side. So I jump from side to side. Don't do very long stitches. And as you can see, you can barely see my stitching. And the idea is you really don't want to see the stitching. You want it to somewhat replicate the sewing machine. So I come in, I catch it to the other side, I walk it inside the seam, and this takes, if 2 minutes. Make sure that I pull that, and you will have a clean. All of this would disappear, of course, if my thread matched, but I go to this side, ride it inside of that seam, come back to this side, ride my needle down the seam, go back to this side, and yep, I think I have reached both ends, and now I'm just going to take a little stitch and lock it like I do with a double knot. Well, after I've done my double knot, I'm going to place my needle back inside the seam and pull it, and when I cut, the thread tail is inside. I'm not going to see that thread tail at all. Now I no longer have a hole in the bottom of the bag, and at this point I'm going to simply push my lining inside. Again, those points, those corners with the lining, and I have now a zippered pouch. You can press it at some point or not. Normally, if you are doing this to sell, you would definitely press it, because the expectation on a bought piece of apparel or accessory has very clean corners. My corner here isn't pushed out enough, so I'm going to make sure that I have got that pushed out as well.